The ferry rocked gently as it prepared to depart the bustling harbour, its horn sounding a long, echoing blast that signalled the beginning of its journey. Among the crowd of travellers was Anna Morris, a single mother in her early 30s, clutching the stroller that held her year-old son, Elliot. Anna's tired eyes betrayed the weight she carried not just from a demanding work week, but from a life shaped by struggle and perseverance. She had chosen this ferry ride as a rare escape, a short trip to the nearby islands, where she hoped to find a few moments of peace away from the chaos of her reality. Elliot babbled softly in his stroller, his tiny hands reaching for the straps of his blanket. Anna smiled faintly at her son, brushing a lock of her dark hair out of her face as the sea breeze began to pick up. The ferry was alive with the sounds of families chatting, tourists snapping photos, and the occasional bark of a dog impatiently waiting to board. Anna maneuvered her way to an open spot on the deck, positioning the stroller near the railing so Elliot could look out over the water. The gentle motion of the waves seemed to calm him, and she leaned against the railing, savouring the cool air. Nearby, a group of teenagers laughed loudly, their voices mingling with the distant sound of seagulls. The atmosphere was lively but not overwhelming, just what Anna had hoped for. Standing a few feet away, however, was someone who noticed Anna with a very different set of emotions. Officer Ray Walker, a stocky man in his 40s with a perpetually sour expression, leaned against the wall near the entrance to the lounge. Ray was a former Marine who now worked as a security officer for the ferry line, a job he had taken after being discharged under murky circumstances. His years in the military had left him with a short fuse and a penchant for asserting his authority in ways that often crossed the line. As he scanned the deck, his gaze landed on Anna. Something about her, a subtle mix of her simple clothing and calm demeanour, immediately irritated him. In his mind, she didn't belong. She looked too comfortable, too sure of herself, and for Ray, that was reason enough to watch her closely. Anna, oblivious to Ray's scrutiny, focused on entertaining Elliot. She pulled out a small stuffed giraffe from the stroller's storage compartment and waved it playfully in front of him. The baby giggled, his laughter pure and uninhibited, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Anna felt a brief surge of joy, a rare moment where the weight on her shoulders seemed to lift, even if only slightly. She didn't notice the shadow that Ray cast as he moved closer, his arms crossed over his chest, observing her every move with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Ray's mind began to spin as he created a narrative to justify his growing hostility. What was she doing here alone with a baby? Why did she look so relaxed? Why was her stroller pack so full? His paranoia grew with each passing second, fueled by years of unchecked biases and the need to exert control wherever he could. He clenched his jaw as he shifted his weight, preparing to approach her under the guise of performing his duty. Meanwhile, Anna adjusted the blanket around Elliot, ensuring he was snug against the brisk sea breeze. She took a deep breath, savouring the salty air and the soft crash of the waves against the hull. The ferry's engines roared to life, and the boat began to move, slowly pulling away from the dock. Passengers waved to those left on the shore, and the teenagers nearby shouted playful goodbyes to their friends on the pier. Anna closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to relax in the rhythmic motion of the ferry cutting through the water. Ray took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the deck, and stopped just a few feet away from Anna. He stood there silently for a moment, as if deliberating how to begin his interrogation. His presence was imposing, his stance wide and rigid, clearly designed to assert dominance. Anna glanced up briefly, sensing someone nearby, but quickly turned her attention back to Elliot, not realizing the storm that was brewing. Ray's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Ma'am," he said, his tone devoid of politeness. "What's in the stroller?" Startled, Anna looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Excuse me?" she replied, unsure if he was even talking to her. Ray stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I asked what's in the stroller," he repeated, his voice louder this time. "It looks overpacked. I need to make sure you're not carrying anything dangerous." Anna blinked, taken aback by his aggressive tone. "It's just baby supplies," she said calmly, gesturing toward the stroller. "Diapers. A change of clothes, snacks. You're welcome to check if you need to, but I assure you it's nothing unusual." Her composed response seemed to irritate Ray even more. He wasn't used to people, especially women like Anna, responding to him without fear or submission. He took another step closer, looming over her. "It's not about what you say," he barked. "It's about making sure everyone here is safe. Open it up." Anna hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers who were now watching the exchange. She felt a tightness in her chest as she realized the attention was shifting to her, and she instinctively reached for the stroller's handle, as if to shield Elliot from the confrontation. "Look," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not sure what the problem is, but I'd appreciate it if you spoke to me respectfully. There's no reason to escalate this." Ray's face reddened, his patience wearing thin. He was losing control of the situation and his frustration boiled over. "I decide what's respectful here, lady," he snapped. "And I don't like your attitude. Now step back from the stroller." Anna stood her ground, her heart racing but her voice unwavering. "I'm not going to argue with you," she said, "but I won't let you intimidate me either. If you have a genuine concern, explain it. Otherwise, please leave us alone." Her words hung in the air, a quiet defiance that only enraged Ray further. He clenched his fists, his breathing shallow and rapid. The tension between them was palpable, and the passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered among themselves, wondering what would happen next. Ray's pride and need for control had been challenged, and he was determined to reassert his authority, no matter the cost. The ferry continued its steady course, cutting through the waves as the confrontation escalated, setting the stage for a tragedy that no one on board would soon forget. The steady hum of the ferry's engines filled the air, blending with the gentle murmur of the sea as the boat pushed further away from the harbour. The scene on deck remained lively, but calm. Families chatted, children laughed, and tourists leaned against the railings, snapping pictures of the distant coastline. Anna, still slightly rattled from her brief interaction with Ray, had moved a few feet closer to the edge of the deck, seeking some distance. Elliot was content in his stroller, his tiny hands clutching a soft toy while his eyes followed the glint of the sun on the water. Anna crouched down next to him, adjusting his blanket and whispering soothing words to herself as much as to him. She told herself it was nothing, just an overzealous security guard doing his job. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease his demeanor had left behind. Ray Walker, meanwhile, paced near the lounge entrance, his eyes fixed on Anna like a hawk watching its prey. His blood still simmered from the exchange. Her calm defiance had struck a nerve, one he couldn't ignore. She had questioned his authority, pushed back against his demand, and done so without the fear he expected. It wasn't just a matter of pride anymore, it had become personal. He told himself he was just doing his job, protecting the passengers from potential threats, but the truth was more insidious. Ray felt compelled to prove something to her, to himself, and to anyone else watching. His mind raced with ways to reassert control, each thought darker and more irrational than the last. A few minutes passed, but Ray couldn't let it go. He saw Anna look over her shoulder, glancing in his direction, as if to check whether he was still watching. That brief moment of acknowledgement was all it took to rekindle his anger. He marched forward, his boots thudding against the deck with deliberate force, the sound drawing the attention of nearby passengers. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. He wanted her to know he was coming. Anna heard the heavy footsteps and turned around just as Ray stopped a few feet from her. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "We're not done here," he announced, his voice louder than necessary. The casual conversations around them faltered as heads began to turn, the atmosphere shifting from relaxed to uneasy. Anna straightened up, keeping her hand on the stroller's handle. "I thought we already resolved this," she said evenly, though her heart was racing. "I told you what's in the stroller. There's no issue." Ray scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't get to decide when this is over," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "This isn't about you, lady. This is about the safety of everyone on this ferry, and I don't trust you." Anna frowned, her patience wearing thin. "What exactly don't you trust?" she asked, her voice still steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm here with my son. I haven't done anything wrong. You're harassing me for no reason." Ray took a step closer, his shadow falling over her and the stroller. "Harassing you," he repeated, his voice rising. "You think this is harassment? I'm trying to prevent a potential threat, and you're acting like I'm the problem. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind cooperating." "I've already cooperated," Anna replied, her grip tightening on the stroller. "But this is crossing the line. I'm asking you to back off." Ray's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he leaned in closer. "You don't give me orders," he hissed. "I don't care who you think you are. You're not above the rules, and you sure as hell don't get to tell me how to do my job." The tension between them was palpable now, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Passengers nearby began to edge away, their nervous whispers carrying in the air. Some pulled out their phones, not to record but to hold them tightly, as if ready to call for help if things escalated further. A young couple sitting on a nearby bench exchanged worried glances, the man leaning over to his partner and murmuring, "This doesn't look good." Anna felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, but she refused to back down. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her, not in front of her son. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I just want to enjoy this trip with my baby. Please, leave us alone." But Ray wasn't listening. He couldn't listen. Her calmness, her refusal to cower, only fueled his rage. To him, it wasn't just defiance, it was disrespect. And he wasn't going to let her get away with it. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" he snapped, his voice booming now. "You think you're better than everyone else here? Like the rules don't apply to you?" Anna blinked, genuinely confused. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "This isn't about rules. This is about you targeting me for no reason." Ray's hand shot out, gripping the handle of the stroller. The sudden movement made Elliot cry out, his small voice cutting through the rising tension. Anna instinctively pulled the stroller back, her heart pounding as fear gripped her chest. "Don't touch it," she shouted, her voice breaking for the first time. "What's wrong with you?" Ray didn't let go. Instead, he yanked the stroller toward him, the wheels screeching against the deck. Elliot's cries grew louder, tears streaming down his tiny face as Anna struggled to hold on. The crowd around them froze, unsure of how to react. Some gasped, while others whispered urgently, their voices filled with disbelief. "You're making a scene," Anna said, her voice trembling now. "Let go of my son's stroller. I'll decide what's necessary," Ray barked back. "And if you won't cooperate, I'll do it myself." In a moment of desperation, Anna pushed against the stroller with all her strength, wrenching it free from Ray's grasp. The force sent her stumbling backward, but she quickly regained her balance, placing herself between Ray and her son. "Stay away from us," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This has gone too far." Ray stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes wild with anger. For a brief second it seemed like he might back down, but then something inside him snapped. He reached out, not for the stroller this time, but for Anna herself. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he roared, grabbing her arm and shoving her toward the railing. The crowd erupted in shocked cries, several passengers standing up as if to intervene but hesitating, unsure of how far they could go. Anna stumbled against the cold metal, her body pressing against it as she twisted to shield Elliot from Ray's reach. "Stop," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "You're hurting me." But Ray didn't stop. He shoved her again, harder this time, until her grip on the stroller loosened. With one final push, he sent both Anna and the stroller teetering dangerously close to the edge. Time seemed to slow as the crowd collectively gasped, the realization of what was happening dawning too late. Anna's eyes locked on Elliot's, her arms reaching for him as the stroller tipped forward, her body following it over the railing. For a brief, agonizing moment, there was silence, then a splash, sharp and deafening, as mother and child hit the water below. The deck erupted into chaos, passengers shouting and running toward the railing, their faces pale with horror. Ray stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. The world around him seemed to blur as the sound of the waves swallowed the frantic cries of the crowd. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no going back. The deafening splash echoed through the air as Anna and her son disappeared into the churning water below. For a brief, surreal moment, the deck was consumed by stunned silence. Every passenger seemed frozen in time, their collective disbelief palpable as they stared at the railing where Anna had stood moments before. The faint sound of Elliot's panicked cries could be heard above the waves, a heartbreaking reminder of the horror unfolding beneath them. Anna hit the icy water with a jarring force, the cold searing through her body like knives. Instinctively, she clung to the stroller as it sank, her desperate hands fumbling to unbuckle Elliot from the straps. The salt water stung her eyes, and the weight of her soaked clothing dragged her down. But she refused to let go. Kicking furiously, she fought her way to the surface, gasping for air as she cradled her son against her chest. Elliot's cries pierced the air, sharp and desperate, his small body shivering violently. "It's okay, baby," Anna choked out, her voice trembling as much from fear as from the freezing cold. "Mummy's got you. I've got you." Above, chaos erupted. Passengers scrambled to the railing, leaning over to catch a glimpse of the water below. Some shouted for help, while others argued about what to do. "Someone call the captain." A man's voice bellowed. "She's got a baby down there." Another woman cried, her voice breaking. Yet amidst the confusion, one figure remained eerily still, Ray Walker. He stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and blank, as if he were watching someone else's nightmare unfold. His chest heaved with rapid breaths, but his eyes betrayed no regret, only shock. He couldn't comprehend what he had done, or perhaps he didn't want to. "Ray, what the hell did you just do?" a voice yelled, snapping him out of his trance. It was one of the crew members, a young deckhand who had witnessed the entire altercation. He rushed toward Ray, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You shoved her. You threw her overboard with her baby." "I didn't," Ray started, but his voice faltered. He looked down at his hands as if they were foreign objects, the weight of his actions beginning to dawn on him. She wouldn't listen. She was being uncooperative, he muttered, almost to himself. Uncooperative. The deckhand shouted, incredulous. That's your excuse. You nearly killed them. The commotion drew the attention of more passengers, who began circling around Ray, their faces a mix of fury and fear. He's lying. Someone yelled. We all saw it. He shoved her. Another voice added, that poor woman didn't do anything. She was just trying to protect her baby. The crowd's anger grew louder, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and outrage. Ray took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio, as if it could somehow shield him from the storm he had created. Meanwhile, in the water, Anna continued to fight against the current. Each wave seemed stronger than the last, crashing over her head and threatening to pull her under. She tightened her grip on Elliot, who was now coughing and sputtering, his tiny hands clutching at her jacket. Hold on, baby, she whispered through chattering teeth, her arms burning from the effort. Just hold on. Her mind raced as she searched for a way out, but the ferry was still moving, the churning wake making it nearly impossible to stay afloat. Her legs were cramping, her strength waning, and the weight of her soaked clothing was dragging her down. Desperation clawed at her, but she refused to give in. She had to survive for Elliot. Back on deck, the captain finally arrived, his face a mask of controlled panic as he pushed through the crowd. What's going on here? He demanded, his authoritative tone cutting through the noise. The passengers immediately began shouting over one another, their voices a chaotic jumble of accusations. He pushed her overboard. She's in the water with her baby. You need to stop the ferry. The captain raised his hands, silencing them with a sharp whistle. Enough, he barked. One at a time. What happened? The deckhand stepped forward, pointing an accusatory finger at Ray. Here's what happened. This idiot shoved that woman overboard with her kid. I saw the whole thing. The captain's eyes widened as he turned to Ray, his expression darkening. Is this true? He demanded. Ray opened his mouth to respond, but his words caught in his throat. He knew the truth would damn him, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. She was being aggressive, he stammered, his voice weak. I was trying to de-escalate the situation. De-escalate? The captain repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. By throwing her off my ferry. He took a step closer, his towering presence intimidating even Ray. You're done, he growled. Give me your badge and your radio. Now. Ray hesitated, his face flushing with humiliation. He glanced around at the crowd, their condemning stares burning into him. Reluctantly, he unhooked his radio and badge, handing them over with trembling hands. The captain snatched them away, his disgust evident. Get off my deck and wait in the lounge. We'll deal with you when this is over. As Ray slunk away, the captain turned his attention back to the situation at hand. He barked orders to the crew, his voice sharp and commanding. Stop the engines. Deploy the rescue boat. And someone get me a line on the Coast Guard, now. The crew scrambled to comply, their movements quick and efficient. Within moments, the ferry's engines ground to a halt, and a small inflatable boat was lowered into the water. Anna's strength was nearly gone by the time she saw the rescue boat approaching. Her vision blurred from exhaustion and salt water, but the sight of the orange vessel filled her with a renewed sense of hope. Over here, she cried weakly, her voice barely audible over the waves. One of the rescuers spotted her and shouted to the others, pointing in her direction. The boat turned toward her, its engine roaring as it cut through the water. Hang on, ma'am. We've got you. One of the rescuers called out as they neared. Two crew members leaned over the side, extending a rescue pole toward her. Anna reached for it with trembling hands, her grip slipping on the slick surface. "I've got a baby," she gasped, her voice cracking. "Please, take him first." The rescuers nodded, their movements swift and practiced. One of them leaned over further, scooping Elliot from her arms with remarkable precision. The baby wailed as he was lifted into the boat, his cries loud and piercing. Anna watched through tear-filled eyes as he was wrapped in a warm blanket, his tiny body trembling but alive. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived as another wave crashed over her, pulling her under. "Mom!" the rescuer shouted, panic flashing across his face. He leaned over further, gripping the pole tightly as he searched the water. Anna surfaced moments later, coughing and sputtering, her limbs flailing weakly. I can't," she choked out, her strength finally giving way. "Hold on," the rescuer yelled. He plunged his arm into the water, grabbing her by the back of her jacket. With a grunt of effort, he hauled her toward the boat, his crewmates rushing to help. Together they pulled her aboard, her soaked body collapsing onto the floor as she gasped for air. "You're okay," one of the rescuers said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We've got you. You're safe now." Anna clung to the sound of his voice, her chest heaving as she fought to regain her breath. She turned her head toward Elliot, who was being cradled by another crew member. His cries had subsided, replaced by soft whimpers. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My baby." "He's fine," the rescuer assured her, smiling gently. "He's safe. You both are." As the rescue boat made its way back to the ferry, the passengers erupted into cheers and applause, their relief palpable. Anna's trembling hands reached for Elliot as soon as they were reunited, her tears falling freely as she held him close. She kissed his damp forehead, her gratitude overwhelming. But as the boat docked and Anna was helped back onto the ferry, her relief was quickly replaced by a simmering anger. She looked around at the crowd, their faces filled with sympathy and guilt. Her eyes finally landed on Ray, who stood in the lounge, his head lowered and his fists clenched. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The rescue boat gently bumped against the side of the ferry as the crew helped Anna and Elliot climb back aboard. The deck, which had moments earlier been filled with the chaos of panic and shouts, now fell into a tense, heavy silence. Passengers stood huddled in small groups, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief at what had just unfolded. Anna clung tightly to her son, his small body wrapped in a dry blanket provided by the rescue team. Her own clothes were soaked and clinging to her, the cold air biting through her skin, but she barely felt it. Her focus was on Elliot, whose cries had subsided into exhausted whimpers. She kissed his forehead, murmuring soothing words, though her own heart raced with a mix of relief, fear, and growing anger. The captain stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. He watched as Anna was helped to a bench on the deck, one of the crew members offering her another blanket to wrap around her shivering. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed the entire ordeal, were whispering among themselves, their voices low but urgent. A few glanced toward the lounge, where Ray Walker stood behind the glass doors, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His face was red, his movements jerky and restless. He was no longer the authoritarian figure he had projected earlier. Now he seemed small, almost desperate, as he tried to process what had just happened. Anna's trembling hand smoothed Elliot's blanket as she looked up at the captain. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "You and your crew saved our lives." The captain nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You're welcome, ma'am," he replied, his tone heavy with the weight of the situation. "But I owe you more than an apology for what happened here today. This is unacceptable. Anna's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had been pulled from the water, she allowed herself to feel the full force of her anger. Unacceptable doesn't begin to cover it, she said sharply, her eyes flashing. That man pushed me and my child into the ocean. He could have killed us. The captain winced at the raw emotion in her voice, but he didn't try to placate her. He turned to one of his crew members. "Bring him out here," he said curtly, gesturing toward the lounge where Ray was pacing. The crew member nodded and disappeared inside. As they waited, Anna's gaze swept across the crowd of passengers. She could see the guilt etched on some faces, the fear on others. No one had stepped in when it mattered most. They had stood by and watched as Ray's aggression escalated, and while she understood their hesitation, fear can be paralyzing, it didn't lessen her anger. "You all saw what happened," she said loudly, addressing the crowd. Her voice trembled slightly, but not from weakness. It was the tremble of someone holding back a storm. "You saw what he did to us, and yet none of you stopped him." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. A middle-aged woman stepped forward hesitantly. "We're so sorry," she said, her voice wavering. "We didn't know what to do. Is he supposed to be the one protecting us?" "Protecting us?" Anna's voice cracked with incredulity. "Does throwing a mother and her child overboard look like protection to you?" She stood, clutching Elliot to her chest, her damp hair plastered to her face. "You didn't know what to do. You stand up. You say something. You don't let someone like that get away with this." The woman's face crumpled, and she stepped back into the crowd, but no one else spoke up. The silence was deafening. At that moment, the doors to the lounge swung open, and Ray stepped onto the deck, flanked by two crew members. He looked disheveled, his uniform wrinkled, his face a mixture of defiance and unease. His eyes darted toward Anna and quickly away again, unable to hold her gaze. The passengers parted to let him through, their faces hard with judgment. Ray stopped a few feet away from Anna, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The captain stepped between them, his presence commanding. "Walker," he said, his voice cold and firm, "you've put me in a situation I never thought I'd face. You've endangered the lives of two passengers, and you've betrayed the trust of everyone on this ferry." Ray's jaw worked as if he wanted to respond, but no words came. He glanced at Anna again, his expression flickering between anger and fear. "I want to hear him say it," Anna said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense air. "I want to hear him admit what he did." Ray looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice low but defensive. "You were resisting. You were being uncooperative. You pushed me," Anna interrupted, her voice rising. "You shoved me and my baby into the ocean. And now you're standing here pretending it was justified." Her hands trembled, but her grip on Elliot was firm. "Look at him." She gestured to her son, his tiny face still streaked with tears. "He's a baby. What kind of monster do you have to be to do something like that?" Ray's face reddened, but he didn't respond. The captain turned to him, his eyes blazing. "Walker, I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. If you can't admit what you did, you leave me no choice but to turn this matter over to the authorities the second we dock." The mention of authorities seemed to rattle Ray. He took a step back, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "She was being difficult. I thought she was a threat." "A threat?" Anna laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "A single mother with a stroller. That's your idea of a threat?" Ray looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I made a mistake," he said finally. though the words were hollow, lacking any real remorse. A mistake, Anna echoed, her voice breaking. You call what you did a mistake? My son could have drowned. I could have drowned. That's not a mistake. That's an atrocity. The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier hesitation giving way to open condemnation. The captain raised his hand to silence them. Enough, he said firmly. He turned back to Ray. Walker, you're relieved of your duties effective immediately. You'll remain under supervision until we reach the dock, where you will be handed over to the Coast Guard. This is no longer just a disciplinary matter, it's a criminal one. Ray's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue. But then his shoulders sagged, and he nodded, the fight draining out of him. The captain gestured to the crew members. Take him below deck and make sure he doesn't cause any more problems. As Ray was escorted away, Anna sank back onto the bench, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept her going was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. She looked down at Elliot, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep against her chest, his small hand clutching her shirt. She kissed the top of his head, her tears mixing with the salt water still clinging to her face. The captain approached her, his expression softening. Ma'am, he said gently, I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what happened. We'll do everything in our power to make this right. Anna looked up at him, her eyes blazing despite her exhaustion. I appreciate your apology, she said, her voice steady. But making this right isn't just about me and my son. It's about making sure no one else ever has to go through this. The captain nodded solemnly. You have my word. As the ferry resumed its journey toward the dock, the passengers slowly began to disperse, though the tension in the air remained. Anna sat quietly, holding Elliot close, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let this go unanswered. Ray Walker might have tried to silence her, but he had underestimated her resolve. This was far from over. The ferry's engines hummed softly as it continued its journey toward the distant shoreline, but the mood on board was anything but calm. The earlier tension had only deepened since Ray Walker was escorted below deck, and the passengers lingered in clusters, whispering anxiously about what they had witnessed. Anna sat with Elliot bundled tightly in her arms, her body trembling not just from the cold but from the lingering shock of what had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment Ray had shoved her toward the railing, felt the sickening sensation of falling, and heard the roar of the water as it consumed her and her baby. The memory was a constant, crushing weight, and though she was safe now, she couldn't shake the sense of vulnerability that clung to her. Nearby, the captain stood with his crew, his face set in grim determination as he gave quiet orders. Though he appeared composed, the lines of tension on his face betrayed his frustration and anger. This was not the kind of incident he had ever imagined would occur under his watch. A mother and child thrown into the sea by a member of his own staff, it was beyond anything he could have prepared for, and he knew the ramifications would be severe. The passengers' murmurs were growing louder, and though he couldn't hear their exact words, he could sense their distrust. They weren't just angry at Ray, they were questioning the entire ferry operation, including his own leadership. He needed to act decisively to restore order and ensure everyone's safety. Anna took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her thoughts refused to settle. She looked down at Elliot, who was finally asleep in her arms, his small face still pale and damp. He had cried himself into exhaustion, and Anna's heart ached as she thought about how close she had come to losing him. Her mind raced with questions. How could this have happened? Why had no one stepped in sooner? What would have happened if the rescue team hadn't arrived in time? The sheer weight of those unanswered questions pressed down on her, fueling a quiet but fierce resolve. She wouldn't let this go. She couldn't. As she sat lost in thought, one of the crew members approached her cautiously, holding a thermos and a towel. "Ma'am," he said gently, kneeling beside her, "I brought you some hot tea. It might help with the cold. And here's another towel, if you need it." Anna looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She took the thermos with trembling hands and set it beside her, her attention still focused on Elliot. "He hasn't stopped shivering," she murmured, more to herself than to the crew member. The man nodded, his expression sympathetic. "The captain has already radioed for medical assistance," he assured her. "There'll be paramedics waiting for you at the dock. They'll make sure he's okay." Anna nodded absently, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "Good," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. The thought of handing Elliot over to strangers, even medical professionals, made her stomach twist with anxiety. After everything that had happened, her trust in others was at an all-time low. The crew member hesitated, then added, "If you need anything else, just let me know. We're all well. We're all really sorry for what happened." Anna's eyes flicked to him. And though she appreciated his sincerity, she couldn't suppress the bitterness that bubbled up inside her. "Sorry doesn't change what he did," she said quietly. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage." The man nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly, and rose to his feet. "I understand," he said simply, before retreating back toward the captain. As the crew member walked away, Anna's gaze drifted toward the lounge. Through the glass doors, she could see Ray sitting stiffly in a chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wasn't pacing anymore, but his tension was still evident in the way his jaw clenched and his eyes darted around the room. Two crew members stood guard nearby, ensuring he didn't attempt to leave. Anna's stomach churned at the sight of him. The man who had nearly taken her and Elliot's lives sat there, free to move and breathe, while she felt trapped in the suffocating aftermath of his actions. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. The captain's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding as he addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, stepping forward so that he could be seen and heard by all. "I want to thank you for your patience as we work to resolve this situation. I understand that many of you are upset and concerned, and I want to assure you that we are taking this matter extremely seriously." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. The passengers murmured in response, some nodding, others crossing their arms skeptically. "We are currently en route to the nearest dock," the captain continued. "Once we arrive, law enforcement and medical personnel will be on hand to assist. The individual responsible for this incident," his eyes flicked briefly toward the lounge, his tone hardening, "will be handed over to the authorities immediately. This kind of behavior is not only unacceptable, it is criminal, and it will be treated as such." A ripple of approval ran through the crowd, though a few passengers still looked uneasy. One man raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, what about the rest of us?" he asked. "How can we be sure something like this won't happen again?" The captain nodded solemnly. "That's a valid concern," he said. "I can't undo what's happened here today, but I can promise you that we will be conducting a full review of our security policies and personnel. This incident has exposed serious flaws that must be addressed, and we will take every step necessary to ensure the safety and trust of our passengers in the future." The man nodded, seemingly satisfied, and the captain turned his attention to Anna. "Evs." "Morris," he said gently, addressing her directly, "I want you to know that you have my full support in pursuing justice for what's happened to you and your son. Whatever resources you need, whatever assistance we can provide, It's yours. Anna looked up at him, her expression guarded. She appreciated his words, but they felt hollow in the face of what she had endured. Thank you, she said curtly, her voice cool. But justice won't undo the trauma he caused. It won't erase what my son went through. The captain's face tightened, and he nodded. I understand, he said quietly, but I hope it will be a start. As the ferry drew closer to the dock, the atmosphere on board remained heavy with tension. Anna could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, their pity and guilt pressing down on her like a physical force. She hated being the center of attention, hated the way they whispered about her as if she couldn't hear. But most of all, she hated that Ray Walker, the man who had nearly destroyed her life, was sitting comfortably in the lounge, waiting for his fate to be decided by others. It wasn't enough. She wanted him to understand the magnitude of what he had done, to feel the same helplessness and fear she had felt as she clung to her son in the freezing water. The ferry finally slowed as it approached the dock, the sound of the engines shifting to a lower hum. Anna tightened her grip on Elliot, her pulse quickening as the crew prepared to secure the vessel. She could see flashing lights in the distance, police cars and ambulances waiting on the shore. Relief mingled with anxiety as she realized that this ordeal was far from over. There would be questions to answer, statements to give, and undoubtedly more trauma to relive. But she was determined to face it head-on, for Elliot's sake and for her own. As the ferry came to a stop and the gangplank was lowered, the captain approached her one last time. "Ifs, Morris," he said softly, "the authorities are here. They'll want to speak with you first. Are you ready?" Anna took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I've been ready since the moment he pushed us overboard," she said. "Let's finish this." The ferry groaned softly as it docked, the gangplank lowering with a metallic thud that seemed to echo the tension hanging thick in the air. The crowd of passengers remained hushed, their eyes fixed on the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances waiting on the pier. Anna sat stiffly on the bench near the railing, clutching Elliot to her chest. Her son stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper as he nuzzled closer to her, but his exhaustion kept him mostly still. Anna pressed a kiss to the top of his head, her lips trembling as she whispered, "We're almost there, baby. Almost safe." Yet even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Safe from the freezing water, perhaps, but not from the emotional scars that had been carved into both of them today. The captain approached her carefully, as though afraid his presence might startle her. Morris," he said gently, his voice low to avoid attracting further attention from the passengers. "The police are ready to speak with you now. They'll handle this with care, but they'll need your account of what happened. Do you feel up to it?" Anna raised her eyes to meet his, her expression hard despite the weariness that weighed on her. "I don't have a choice," she replied simply. "He nearly killed us. I'm not letting him walk away from this." Her voice carried a quiet strength, but her grip on Elliot tightened instinctively, as if she were drawing courage from his small, warm body. The captain nodded, his jaw clenching slightly. "I'll escort you down. And don't worry, Walker's being held below till the authorities take custody of him. He won't come near you again." Anna didn't respond, but her lips pressed into a thin line. Words meant little to her now. She wanted action, accountability, and justice. Adjusting the blanket around Elliot, she rose to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her, but her determination overriding any physical weakness. The captain led her toward the gangplank, where two police officers waited, their notepads in hand and their expressions carefully neutral. Behind them, a pair of paramedics hovered near a stretcher, their gazes flicking to Elliot with quiet concern. One of the officers stepped forward as Anna approached, his tone calm and measured. "Morris, I'm Officer Daniels." And this is my partner, Officer Lee. We've been briefed on the situation, and we're here to help. First, though, let's make sure you and your son get checked out by the medics. I'm fine, Anna said quickly, though her voice was hoarse from the cold and the strain of the day. Just make sure he's okay. She glanced down at Elliot, whose tiny fingers clutched at her damp shirt even in his sleep. The paramedics stepped in, their movements swift but gentle as they carefully took Elliot from her arms. Anna hesitated, her instincts screaming to keep him close, but the sight of his pale face and shivering form pushed her to let go. I'll stay right here, one of them assured her. He's in good hands. As they began examining Elliot, Anna turned back to the officers, her exhaustion giving way to a sharp, focused anger. What do you need from me? She asked bluntly. We'll need your statement, Daniels said, flipping open his notepad. Start from the beginning what happened on board and what led to the incident. Anna took a deep breath, steadying herself. It started when Walker approached me on the deck, she began, her voice clear despite the tremor of emotion underlying her words. He accused me of being a threat, of carrying something dangerous in my son's stroller. I told him there was nothing there, just baby supplies, but he wouldn't listen. He kept escalating, getting louder and more aggressive. She paused, her jaw tightening as the memory replayed in her mind. Then he grabbed the stroller. My son was inside, and he just yanked it like it was nothing. When I tried to stop him, he shoved me. Hard. I barely managed to keep my balance, but he kept coming at me. He was out of control. Daniels and Lee exchanged a brief glance, their pens moving swiftly as they recorded her account. And that's when he pushed you overboard. Lee prompted gently. Yes, Anna said, her voice breaking slightly. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. He shoved the stroller so hard that it tipped, and I lost my grip. I went over the railing trying to hold on to my son. If the rescue team hadn't gotten to us in time, she trailed off, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. We wouldn't be standing here. Daniels nodded, his expression grim. Thank you, Miss Morris. We understand how difficult this is, and we'll make sure it's handled properly. He glanced over his shoulder, where two other officers were emerging from the ferry with Ray Walker in tow. The disgraced security guard's hands were cuffed in front of him, and his face was pale and drawn. He avoided Anna's gaze entirely, his eyes fixed on the ground as the officers led him toward a waiting police car. Anna's fists clenched at her sides as she watched him pass. For a brief moment, she thought about shouting at him, demanding to know what kind of person could justify such monstrous actions. But she held back, knowing that nothing she said would change who he was. Instead, she focused on the officers escorting him, her voice sharp and unwavering as she called out, "Don't let him get away with this." Daniels turned back to her, nodding firmly. "We won't," he promised. As Walker was placed into the police car, the paramedics returned with Elliot, bundled in a dry blanket and looking much more alert. Anna's heart swelled with relief as she took him back into her arms, kissing his forehead and holding him close. "He's okay," one of the paramedics said with a reassuring smile. "A little shaken up, but no serious injuries. You both should get checked out at the hospital, just to be safe." Anna nodded, though the thought of leaving Elliot even for a moment made her stomach twist. "We'll go," she said softly. "Thank you." The captain approached as the officers prepared to leave, his expression heavy with guilt. Morris," he said quietly. "I can't apologize enough for what happened. I'll be filing a full report with the authorities and I'll make sure Walker is held accountable for his actions. You have my word." Anna looked at him, her gaze steady but distant. "Words won't undo what he did," she said, "but I'll hold you to that promise." As the captain stepped away, The crowd of passengers began to disembark, many casting furtive glances at Anna as they passed. Some muttered words of sympathy or apology, but she barely registered them. Her focus was entirely on Elliot, on the soft rise and fall of his chest as he rested against her. The nightmare wasn't over, not yet. There would be court dates, media attention, and endless retellings of the story. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, holding her son and whispering a silent promise that she would never let anyone harm him again. The ferry grew quiet as the last of the passengers disembarked, leaving Anna alone with the paramedics and the officers. As she stepped onto the dock, the weight of the day settled fully on her shoulders. The fight for justice was only beginning, but she was ready. Ray Walker had underestimated her strength, her resolve. He had tried to silence her, but instead he had given her a voice louder than ever before, and she intended to use it. The courtroom was eerily silent as Anna sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, fractured beams of light across the polished wooden floor. Elliot sat beside her in a small seat, his favorite toy clutched tightly in his tiny hands. Despite the solemnity of the environment, Anna's son seemed calm, his innocence untouched by the gravity of what had brought them here. Anna, on the other hand, could feel every fiber of her being vibrating with tension. She had spent weeks reliving the events of that day on the ferry, preparing for this moment when she would finally confront the man who had so recklessly endangered her and her child. Across the room, Ray Walker sat stiffly at the defense table, his once imposing figure now slumped under the weight of his actions. He looked smaller somehow, his demeanor stripped of the arrogance and bravado he had displayed on the ferry. Dressed in a simple suit that seemed too tight around his shoulders, he avoided Anna's gaze, staring straight ahead at the judge with a hollow expression. His defense team murmured quietly beside him, shuffling papers and adjusting their notes, but Ray didn't seem to be listening. Whatever confidence he might have had at the start of the trial had evaporated in the face of the mounting evidence against him. The trial had been grueling, each detail of that harrowing day laid bare for the court to scrutinize. Witness after witness had taken the stand, passengers and crew members recounting the escalating confrontation, the moment Ray pushed Anna and Elliot overboard, and the frantic rescue that followed. Videos from security cameras and bystanders' phones had been played repeatedly, each one a damning piece of evidence that left little room for doubt. The prosecution had painted a clear picture of a man driven by prejudice and unchecked rage, a man who abused his authority to devastating effect. Anna's testimony had been the hardest part. Sitting on the witness stand, recounting the fear and desperation she had felt as she plunged into the freezing water, holding onto her son for dear life. It had taken every ounce of strength she had to get through it. But she had done it. She had faced Ray directly, her voice unwavering as she described how he had looked at her with disdain, how his hands had shoved the stroller, how he had stood there and watched as she and her baby fell. She had not broken, and she had not wavered. Now, the trial was drawing to a close. The judge's gavel echoed sharply through the room, and all eyes turned to him as he prepared to deliver the verdict. Anna's heart pounded in her chest, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she forced herself to stay calm. She glanced at Elliot, who was blissfully unaware of the weight of the moment, and his innocent expression gave her the strength to face whatever was to come. Raymond Walker, the judge began, his voice deep and resonant. This court has reviewed the evidence presented against you, including testimony from multiple witnesses and video recordings of the incident. The actions you took on that ferry were not only a gross violation of your duties as a security officer, but a reckless endangerment of 2 lives. one of them a child. Anna's breath caught as the judge paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "It is the judgment of this court," he continued, "that you are guilty of assault, reckless endangerment, and abuse of authority. You are hereby sentenced to serve 10 years in state prison, with mandatory psychological evaluation and anger management therapy." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the sentence was delivered. Anna exhaled slowly, her grip on the table loosening as a wave of relief washed over her. She had known the trial would likely end this way. The evidence had been overwhelming, but hearing the words aloud brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Ray's head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly as the reality of his fate set in. For a fleeting moment, Anna felt a pang of pity for him. But then she remembered the cold, calculating look in his eyes as he had shoved her toward the edge of the ferry, and any sympathy she might have felt dissolved. The judge's gavel struck again, signaling the end of the proceedings. People began to rise from their seats, murmuring quietly as they filed out of the courtroom. Anna remained seated for a moment, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind buzzing with a strange mix of emotions. Relief. Vindication. Sadness for what could have been lost. She looked down at Elliot, who was now playing with his toy, oblivious to the significance of the day. A hand on her shoulder startled her, and she turned to see her attorney, a kind-faced woman named Rachel, smiling down at her. "You did it, Anna," Rachel said softly. "It's over." Anna nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed to say, "for everything." Rachel squeezed her shoulder gently. "You were the one who had the courage to stand up and fight. I just helped. Now it's time for you and Elliot to move forward." As Rachel stepped away, Anna rose to her feet, lifting Elliot into her arms. She walked slowly out of the courtroom, the sounds of footsteps and voices fading as she stepped into the quiet hallway. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt warmer now, as though the weight of the past weeks had finally begun to lift. She held Elliot close, kissing his cheek as she whispered, "We're okay now, baby. We're okay." The days that followed were a whirlwind of media attention and public reactions. The story of the mother who had survived being thrown overboard with her child captured national headlines, sparking debates about abuse of authority and systemic failures in oversight. Anna gave a few carefully chosen interviews, focusing not on the trauma she had endured but on the broader implications of what had happened. "This isn't just about me," she told one reporter. "It's about ensuring that people in positions of power are held accountable. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Support poured in from across the country, letters, donations to help cover her legal fees, and even offers of pro bono therapy for her and Elliot. Though she appreciated the kindness, Anna remained grounded, focusing on rebuilding her life one step at a time. She returned to her work at the community center, helping others who had faced adversity, finding solace in the act of giving back. One crisp morning, Anna took Elliot to the pier where the ferry had departed on that fateful day. She stood at the edge of the water, holding her son's hand as he toddled beside her. The waves lapped gently against the dock, their rhythm soothing and steady. For the first time in weeks, Anna felt a sense of peace. She knelt beside Elliot, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You're so brave," she said softly, her voice filled with love. "You've been through so much, but you're still my happy, sweet boy." Elliot giggled, reaching up to touch her face. "Mama," he said simply, his voice filled with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child. Anna smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had faced fear, anger, and heartbreak, but she had emerged stronger. And as she looked out at the endless horizon, the sunlight dancing on the water, she knew that she and Elliot were ready to move forward together, unbroken and unafraid.